Okay. So, good morning, Dr. Burning. How are you?
Hi, Dr. Groveman. Good to see you as well.
Good. Why don't we just begin by you talking about what you're doing, what activities you're engaged in, what research?
Sure. I'm, a professor at Chestnut Hill College, which has a APA-approved doctoral program in clinical psychology in Philadelphia, and I really remain sort of the systemic expert there. So that most of my work really is about either teaching on issues of systems theory and family therapy, couples therapy, or a little bit about evidence-based practice. And in that way, I'm also doing, a book of mine is coming out that I co-edited with Brad Van Eden Moorfield out of APA Books called Treating Contemporary Families Toward an Inclusive Practice, which I think is a very interesting sort of format of linking
Yeah.
research and clinical practice. I have some articles coming out right now, so on paradox, and I've had a recent one about the genogram. And I'm applying for a special issue at the Couple and Family Psychology Journal, so we'll see how that comes together.
Wow.
So mainly, in the academic realm, focusing on systems issues.
So, yeah, I mean, it sounds like you have a lot of free time. So, but
And I'm supervising as well in creating a new instrument called the GBIM, the genogram based
okay.
interaction measure, which I'm rather excited about working with the clinical team on that one.
Uh-huh. Well, let's start with that one then, because it sounds very interesting. Could you tell us a little about it?
Yeah, I think that we all know that as system thinkers, the genogram is our go-to tool.
Mhm.
But for most of us interested in trying to do evidence-based practice, we need some form that sort of gives us outcome, treatment outcome.
Mm.
And because a lot of us don't really feel interested in using the CAFIS or the CARES or some of the longer instruments on a regular basis, they're generally used more at research facilities. Generally, the average practitioner doesn't do a lot of outcome. I decided I wanted to create an instrument that would really make it possible for the average practitioner to have an outcome measure that really is virtually practice as usual. So what we did was me and my team of Rachel Hull and Ali Rozovsky, we created the instrument that is a genogram with 8 sort of interactional symbols. Each symbol has a particular score attached to it. We went through a series of test management sort of research projects to assess exactly how reliable, how valid this instrument is, and we're getting fantastic data because the instrument is done in collaboration with the client or clients, depending on how many people show up to the session. And you're virtually saying to them, what do you're showing them the legend that has
Mhm.
possibly, let's say, good relationship, cordial relationship, conflicted relationship, and each of them has a score, and you're asking them what they think is the relationship between the various dyads in what they consider their primary family. Now, by primary, we extend that to be possibly if it's a divorced spouse, it still is important on issues of discipline, and so it's really someone who's emotionally connected to what you consider your system.
Mhm.
And surprisingly, most people generally agree on those people that fit into that context. So you end up with a score. What you do is you actually tally let's say the 10 dyads that you have in this
Mhm.
family system. You tally that score, you divide by 10, you come up with a number that usually ranges from -2 to +2. And then if you give that instrument 5 sessions later, you'll see if the score has gone up or down. So it's really provided us with a tool that is wonderful for supervision because the minute you look at a genogram with interactional symbols, you'll say, okay, wait a minute, this relationship between the mom and daughter is conflicted. I mean, right off the bat, you're sort of getting an idea of case conceptualization from the instrument. And on top of that, you're getting quantitative data. So you're able to say, I really am practicing an evidence-based practice. I read the research about the families that I'm treating. I get supervision or I have clinical expertise. And now I'm assessing it. And those are sort of the 3 components that APA acknowledges sort of equals evidence-based practice, which is what I think we're all aiming to do. But I think a lot of us recognize that that tight notion of evidence-supported treatment, the one where we sort of go to the SAMHSA site and looks at the manualized treatments, they don't really apply as much to the systems thinker. They're really better for the individual treatment of panic or individual depression. And I think for those purposes, they work beautifully. But those of us who are doing systems work need to evaluate what we're doing, because generally, even though there are good evidence-supported practices in our field, such as emotion-focused or MSFT, or attachment-based stuff of Guy Diamond, it still is something where a lot of us are integrationists. We're using various sort of systems ideas in our work in terms of, especially if we're working with complex families, such as step families or families of divorce or families on the spectrum. We're using a different sort of understanding of what they need in order to improve. And so we have to have some method of determining, is our therapy working? And I think the GBIM does exactly that. So it's been published once, but we're going to apply for a journal article to really get it established as an independent instrument.
So, I mean, that is so excellent, because I know, as just from the clinician's point of view, it is so important to have an instrument that can measure and demonstrate progress, and especially when you're including the family in that process, and it's not just taking notes afterwards or checking off boxes afterwards. So that's great. Is it available currently?
Well, at this point, I'm glad to share it, frankly. I mean, but no, I mean, in terms of it is coming out in the APA book I referred to, it is described, and the procedure is defined in that book. But hopefully this journal article will have all of the psychometric data, letting people understand how established it is at this point. But yes, the in the upcoming APA book, Treating Contemporary Families, there will be access to the GBIM in that book.
Well, that's great to hear. And speaking of, treating contemporary families, what is the book about? What kinds of contemporary families?
Well, it's really an interesting concept, Alan. I'm very excited by it, and APA is very excited by it too, which is I'm very pleased by. What I decided, and Brad Van Eden Moorfield is a researcher, and I'm a clinical scholar, and our feeling was that our two fields, our two aspects of looking at family and systemic issues, don't really play well together. That we all need research, and research needs clinical to have a practical application, but we really are separate silos, and there's nothing that makes us completely integrated. It's a different thought process. They're trying to determine exactly what variables need to be understood to be able to make some statements of fact, significant fact about different families. And we're looking at how do you intervene with these families. So there are aspects in which the material sort of is useful one another. We scaffold off each other, but to say we're integrated is a false sort of statement. It's not really a true integration, because our thought process is actually different. So what Brad and I talked about, the fact is, this is my third book now that's done this kind of format, but we finally got to a level that I think is sophisticated enough that it worked. Mm-hmm. What we did was saying to the researchers, before you write your research section, you have to speak to the clinical first author, mm-hmm. and with that clinical first author, determine exactly the kind of findings that are useful clinically. Mm-hmm. And the clinical people, before you write your section, you go through the research section that has been written now by the researcher and find specific sort of aspects of findings that actually can be made into an intervention, that, that statement would be a useful normalization for such a family, a gay and lesbian family, a family with interpersonal violence, a family in which there is someone who's been deployed, so that we look at these contemporary families and we look at sort of creating a pattern so that the researchers and clinicians had to actually have Skype and Zoom discussions that force them to think, what is it that's useful about the other person's material that I can use in terms of writing sort of my chapter? So each chapter takes a specific interactional problem, for example, co-parenting. And we look at co-parenting from 4 different family types: step families, divorced families, families with a member on the autism spectrum, and families with domestic violence or interpersonal violence. And so what we have is a short research section that covers those 4 family types in the research section in maybe 10 pages, that covers all 4 family types. Then we go into the clinical section, and that's actually, it's more like 6 pages on the research section, then about 12 pages on the clinical section. So each family, we sort of talk about what research is relevant to that family type. Here's a case example, and here's the intervention based on that research that you just read. So we have formed that for 7 different interactional problems. And we have one chapter that looks at intersectionality at the beginning, and we have one chapter at the end, which is the one I mentioned, that helps look at how to do outcome studies. But the bulk of the book is really taking these 7 interactional problems and looking at case studies and interactions based directly on the research that they've just read. So I think it's a model that's really useful.
Yeah, it sounds it, because I know that there's continues to be a gap between the researchers and the clinicians, and how do we apply the research in our everyday work. And it sounds like the book, Scott, is just ideal for helping the clinician bridge that gap.
Yeah, I mean, Alan, I'm glad to send you the manuscript if you want to take a look at it. I'm really excited by what it could offer in terms of getting people to realize how interesting research can be if you tailor it to what clinical people need. And I think for the researchers, it's satisfying because they don't love writing these things that are only read by researchers. They do want us to apply it.
Right.
But so often you and I, as clinical scholars, read some of the research and find ourselves saying that, there's too little findings that are really relevant to us, and the West doesn't feel that relevant.
Yeah.
And so, I think that having it become, helping to teach researchers how to make it more relevant, but also saying, here, we're going to use your material directly in this intervention so they can see how it's applied. I think it's a win-win.
It sounds it. And when is the book scheduled to come out, Scott?
Well, we're sending back we've gotten back our reviews from APA, and they're very positive. And a couple changes that we've made. So we're sending that back now. So I'm not exactly sure what their turnaround is, but I would imagine probably late summer, early fall.
Wonderful. So soon, which is wonderful, because I certainly, I'm going to put my order in.
Thank you. And the GBIM, by the way, Rachel, Ali, and I are presenting. We've been accepted for APA for the upcoming annual convention to present the GBIM. So if anyone has any interest in learning more about that, it will be a presentation on the upcoming convention.
Well, one other thing before, I know our time is getting close to running out, but one other thing I'd like to ask is, as an ABIP psychologist in couple and family psychology, what motivated you to get an ABIP? What was the purpose of it? What benefits do you see in it?
Both practical and sort of personal. The practical is that my college, Chestnut Hill College, had a great interest in having as many faculty with ABIPs as possible. It's the highest level, being a board certified. We really want to advocate for the highest level of certification in the field. But it's interesting that my program is a clinical psych program, and I am the systems person there. And when I first said I want to go for a CFP, they said, well, maybe you should go for clinical or a clinical program. I said, no, that's not who I am. Who I am is a couple and family psychologist. And they respected that, and they said that'd be great. And so I went for that, and I really didn't know exactly a lot about the ABIP before I went for it. And then I ended up getting on the board because I found it so fascinating, in terms of this idea that we really help determine, do people understand system thinking? Are they using system thinking? And, obviously the VA gives a little, price bump, salary bump to people. There are many ways in which the ABIP has practical sort of application. But I think that what it does also is say, we are scholars in an area that we believe is very important. And I think system thinking has gotten to the point where people know it's important, and when they study it, they never leave it. They love it, but too many people just have sort of a minor sense of what it means. And
Mm.
I think that we have to have more scholars who say, yes, this is important enough to sort of stamp into my CV that this is who I am, and that I'm board certified in this type of thinking, so that we end up sort of extending this field. Because I think that more and more we realize, whether it be addiction, whether it be, any of the various problems that we're seeing, if you don't engage the family, obviously anorexia, any of them, if you don't engage the family, basically what you're ending up with is limited success.
Exactly.
Individual therapy is wonderful, and it does what it does well with certain problems. But there are other problems that, unless you address the context, you'll never really help that person or that family move forward. And my hope is that, more and more ABIPs and CFP are able to sort of make this point and really make this field so established that it gets to the point where people recognize the importance of what we're really offering the field.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And
I really am grateful for you, Alan, for what you're doing with the newsletter, what you're doing with this video series. I think that people need to understand what people in this field are doing, and you're doing a wonderful job to make this clear.
yeah, well, I mean, my goal is just to make people sick of hearing about ABIP and CFP because I think it is so important and so valuable.
Yeah, I think so.
I can speak from personal experience, of course, with that. Though, before we end, Scott, first of all, thank you so much. This has been just fascinating.
You're welcome.
About what you're doing and the exciting things that are going on. I mean, that's great. The only thing I'm going to ask is you have to promise to come back, because there's so many other topics I want to talk to you about, including step families and things like that.
I'd love to.
I know that you're certainly knowledgeable in that, and I'd love you to share your knowledge. So
I'd love to come back.
thank you so much.
You're more than welcome, Alan. Thank you.
Take care now.
Bye-bye now.